Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to our channel Expert Analysis. Today we will talk about Palestine issue. First of all, let's look at the introduction. At the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a dispute over land and borders. The geography of the conflict revolves around the three territorial units of Israel: the West Bank, Gaza, defined by armistice lines drawn after a war in the region in 1948. Since then, military action, settlement, and population growth have also shaped the situation on the ground. Now let's look at the map of the Israel-Palestine. The green area shows the area of Palestine. The white one indicates Israel in 1946, then in 1947, then in 1949 to 1967, and then in 2008. How Israel has grown. Israel. With the end of World War II, the Arab-Israeli conflict became the major political and military problem in the Middle East. After the Holocaust, many of the survivors had no place to go. Many Jews, Zionists, believed that they should have a homeland of their own. They concentrated on the biblical area of Israel. After World War I, the area had come under the British Mandate of Palestine. When Jewish immigration accelerated, friction was created by Jews and Palestinian Arabs. After 1945, Zionists and Palestinian Arabs wanted individual nations, and both felt they had claim to Palestine. British withdrew in 1947 and the UN proposed that country be partitioned 50-50. War broke out when the Jews, certain of US and Soviet support, declared their independence and the creation of a new state of Israel on May 14, 1948. When fighting ended in 1949, the Israelis had conquered more territory than had been envisioned in the UN plan, and the territory had been given to Israel. Rest of the territory fell to Egypt and Jordan rather than forming an independent Palestinian state. Palestinian Arab refugees fled to Lebanon, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Balfour Declaration 1917. Balfour Declaration, November 2, 1917, statement of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was made in a letter from Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, to Lionel Walter Rothschild and 2nd Baron Rothschild, a leader of Anglo-Jewish community. The Balfour Declaration, issued through the continued efforts of Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolov, Zionist leaders in London. They fell short of the expectations of the Zionists, who had asked for the reconstitution of Palestine as the Jewish national home. The declaration specifically stipulated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The document, however, said nothing of political or national rights of the communities and did not refer to them by name. Nevertheless, the declaration aroused enthusiastic hopes among the Zionists and seemed the fulfillment of the aims of the World Zionist Organization. The British government hoped that declaration would rally Jewish opinion, especially in the US, to the side of the Allied powers against the Central Powers during World War I. They hoped also that the settlement in Palestine of a pro-British Jewish population might help to protect the approaches to the Suez Canal in neighboring Egypt and thus ensure a vital communication route British colonial possessions in India. The Balfour Declaration was endorsed by the principal Allied powers and was included in the British Mandate over Palestine, formally approved by the newly created League of Nations on July 24, 1922. In May 1939, the British government altered its policy in a white paper recommending a limit of 75,000 further immigrants and an end to the immigration by 1944, unless the resident Palestinian Arabs of the region consented to further immigration. Zionists condemned the new policy, accusing British of favor the Arabs. This point was made moot by the outbreak of World War II and the founding of the state of Israel in 1948. Zionism. Zionism is basically Jewish nationalist movement that has had its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of Jews. Though Zionism originated in Eastern and Central Europe in the later part of the 19th century, it is in many ways a continuation of the ancient attachment of Jews and the Jewish religion to the historical region of Palestine, where one of the hills of the ancient Jerusalem was called Zion. Modern Israeli springs from both religious and political sources. The biblical promise of a land for the Jews and a return to the temple in Jerusalem was enshrined in Judaism and sustained Jewish identity through an exile of 19th centuries following the failed revolts in Judea against the Romans early in the Common Era. By the 1800s, fewer than 25,000 Jews still lived in their ancient homeland, and these were largely concentrated in Jerusalem, then a provincial backwater of the Ottoman Empire. In 1980s, however, a rise in European anti-Semitism and revived Jewish national pride combined to inspire a new wave of immigration in Palestine in the form of agricultural colonies financed by the Rothschilds and the other wealthy families. Now, now political Zionism came a decade later when an Austrian journalist, Theodor Herzl, began advocating a Jewish state as the political solution for both anti-Semitism. He had covered the sensational Dreyfus affair in France and a Jewish secular identity. A political turn was given to Zionism by Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist who regarded assimilation as most desirable but a view of anti Semitism impossible to realize. Thus, he argued if Jews were forced by external pressure to form a nation, they could lead a normal existence only through concentration in one territory. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress at Basel, Switzerland, which drew up the Basel program of the movement, stating that Zionism strives to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. Herzl's belief and dramatic bid for international support from major powers at the first Zionist Congress failed, but after his death in 1904, the surviving Zionist organization, under the leadership of Chaim Weizmann, undertook a major effort to increase the Jewish population in Palestine while continuing to search for political assistance. These efforts could only be on a small scale while the Ottoman Turks ruled that the European called Palestine. But in 1917, during World War I, the Zionists persuaded the British government to issue the Balfour Declaration, a document that committed Britain to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. The center of movement was established in Vienna, where Herzl published weekly Die Welt, the world, Zionist congressman yearly until 1901 and then 2 years. When the Ottoman government refused Herzl's request for Palestinian autonomy, he found support in Great Britain. In 1903, the British government offered 6,000 square miles of uninhabited Uganda for settlement, but Zionists held out for Palestine. This shows they always wanted Palestine. The failure of Russian Revolution of 1905 and the wave of pogroms of repression that followed caused growing numbers of Russian Jewish youth to immigrate to Palestine as pioneer settlers. By 1914, there were about 90,000 Jews in Palestine. 13,000 settlers lived in 43 Jewish agriculture settlements, many of them supported by the French Jewish philanthropist Baron Edmond. Upon the outbreak of World War I, political Zionism reasserted itself, and its leadership passed to Russian Jews living in England. Two such Zionists, Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolov, were instrumental in obtaining the Balfour Declaration. In the following years, the Zionists built up the Jewish urban and rural settlements in Palestine, perfecting autonomous organizations and solidifying cultural life and Hebrew education. In March 1925, the Jewish population in Palestine was officially estimated at 1,80,000 and it rose to about 2,38,000 by 1933. Jewish immigration remained relatively slow, however, until the rise of Hitler in Europe. Nevertheless, the Arab population feared that Palestine would eventually become a Jewish state and bitterly revisited Zionism and the British policy supporting it. British forces struggled to maintain order in face of series of Arab uprisings. The strain of suppressing the Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939, which was more extensive and sustained than earlier uprisings, ultimately led British to reassess its policies. In the hopes of keeping peace between Jews and Palestinian Arabs and retaining Arab support against Germany and Italy in World War II, Britain placed restrictions on Jewish immigration in 1919. The new restrictions were violently opposed by Zionist underground groups such as the Stern Gang and Irgun Zavai Leumi, which emitted acts of terrorism and assassination against the British and the organized illegal Jewish immigration to Palestine. The large scale extermination of European Jews by Nazis led many Jews to seek refuge in Palestine and many others, especially in the US, to embrace Zionism. As tensions grew among the Arabs and Zionists, Britain submitted the solution and later went to the UN, on which UN proposed partition of the country into separate Arab and Jewish states and the internationalization of Jerusalem. Thus, 50 years later, the first Zionist Congress, and the 30 years after the Balfour Declaration, Zionism achieved its aim of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, but at the same time, it became an armed camp surrounded by hostile Arab nations and Palestinian organizations engaged in terrorism and an outside Israel. During the next 2 decades, Zionist organizations in many countries continued to raise financial support for Israel and to encourage Jews to immigrate there. Most Jews, however, reject the view propagated by some very Orthodox Jews in Israel that the Jews were living in exile and could live a full life only in Israel. Now we will talk about British control over Palestine and these areas. Palestine, comprising what are now Israel, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jordan, was among several former Ottoman Arab territories placed under the administration of Great Britain by the League of Nations. The mandate lasted from 1920 to 1948. In 1923, British granted limited autonomy to Transjordan, now known as Jordan. In 1947 to 1949, Israel founded Armistice Line. War broke out in 1948 when Britain withdrew. The Jews declared the State of Israel and troops from neighboring Arab nations moved in. After 8 months of fighting, an armistice line was agreed, establishing the West Bank and Gaza Strip as distinct geographical units. The UN Resolution 181. The UN Resolution 181, passed by the UN General Assembly in 1947, that called for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, with the city of Jerusalem as a corpus separatum, to be governed by a special international regime. The resolution, which was considered by the Jewish community in Palestine to be a legal basis for the establishment of Israel, and which was rejected by the Arab community, was succeeded almost immediately by violence. Palestine had been governed by Great Britain since 1922. Since that time, Jewish immigration for the region had increased, and tensions between Arabs and Jews had grown. In April 1947, exhausted by World War II and increasingly intent upon withdrawing from Middle East region, Britain referred the issue of Palestine to United Nations. To investigate a suitable course of action, the United Nations forms the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, an inquiry committee made up of members of 11 countries. Ultimately, United Nations Security Committee on Palestine delivered two proposals, that of majority, which recommended two separate states joined economically, and that of minority, which supported the formation of a single binational state made up of autonomous Jewish and Palestinian areas. The Jewish community approved of the first of these proposals, which the Arabs opposed them both. Now, a counter proposal including a provision that only those Jews who had arrived before the Balfour Declaration would be citizens of the state did not win Jewish favor. The proposal to partition Palestine based on modified version of United Nations Security Council majority report was put to a General Assembly vote on that day. The fate of the proposal was initially uncertain, but after a period of intense lobbying by pro Jewish groups and individuals, the resolution was passed with 33 votes in favor and 13 against and 10 abstentions. When Israel secured the final armistice of the war in 1949, the new state controlled one-fifth more territory than the original partition plan had specified and rejected a return to the original partition line. Jordan occupied the West Bank, which was much of the area assigned to the UN to the stillborn Palestinian state, and more than 6 lakh Arab refugees fled their homes in an exodus that had begun even before May 1948. 1967 Six-Day War. From 1948 to 1967, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was ruled by Jordan. During this period, the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian military administration. Israeli troops captured Egypt's Sinai Peninsula during the 1956 British, French, and um, Israeli military campaign in response to the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Israelis subsequently withdrew and were replaced with a UN force. In 1967, Egypt ordered UN troops out and blocked Israeli shipping routes, adding to already high levels of tension between Israel and its neighbors. In a preemptive attack on Egypt that drew Syria and Jordan into a regional war in 1967, Israel made massive territorial gains, capturing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal. The principle of land for peace that has formed the basis of Arab-Israeli negotiations is based on Israeli giving up land won in 1967 war in return for peace deals, recognizing Israeli borders and its right to security. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt was part of 1979 peace deal with Israel. East Jerusalem and West Bank from Jordan, Israel got Golan Heights from Syria, Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Jews started to build homes in these neighborhoods that were mostly Muslims. Jerusalem before 1967 and now. The armistice line drawn at the end of 1948 war divided Jerusalem into two. Between 1949 and 1967, Israel controlled the western part of the Jerusalem, while Jordan took the eastern part, including the old walled city containing important Jewish, Muslim, and Christian religious sites. Israel captured the whole Jerusalem in 1967 and extended the city's municipal boundaries, putting both East and West Jerusalem under its sovereignty and civil law. In 1980, Israel passed a law making its annexation of East Jerusalem explicit. The city's status remains disputed, with Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem considered illegal under international law. Israel is determined that Jerusalem to be its undivided capital, while Palestinians are seeking to establish their capital in East Jerusalem. West Bank. West Bank is the area of former British mandated territory of Palestine west of the Jordanian River, claimed from 1949 to 1988 as a part of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan but occupied from 1967 by Israel. The territory excluding East Jerusalem is also known as within Israel by its biblical names Judaka and Samaria. Within its present boundaries, the West Bank represents the portion of the former mandate retained in 1948 by Arab forces that entered Palestine after the departure of the British. The borders and status of the area were established by the Jordanian Israeli armistice of April 3, 1949. In the decades that followed the armistice, Jordan Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel each laid claim to approximately 2,180 square miles area. Geographically, the West Bank is mostly composed of north-south oriented limestone hills, having an average height of 2,300 to 3,000 feet. Since 1967, Israel has pursued a policy of building settlements on West Bank. These cover about 2% of the area of the West Bank and are linked by Israeli controlled roads. They are also large tracts of Israeli controlled land designated as military areas as nature reserves. Now let's talk about the history of West Bank. Upon the departure of British occupying forces in May 1948 and the proclamation of the State of Israel, the armies of five Arab countries entered Palestine. The ensuing conflict, first of the Arab Israeli wars, Israel expanded beyond the territory contemplated by the partition plan. The West Bank, as demarcated by Jordanian Israeli armistice of 1949, was broadly similar to one of the zones designated as an Arab state by UN partition plan for Palestine in 1947. According to that plan, Jerusalem was to have been an international zone. However, the city was instead instead divided into Israeli West and Jordanian East sectors. The Arab state, whose creation was envisioned by the 1947 UN partition plan, never came into being, and the West Bank was formally annexed by Jordan. Although this annexation was recognized only by the Great Britain and Pakistan, from 1950 until it was occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967, the West Bank was governed as part of the Jordan, although it was divided from Jordanian population of East Bank by Jordan River. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the Israeli ruled over the West Bank. Palestinians remained unresolved. Israel regarded possession of the West Bank as vital to its security, and the growing number of Israeli settlements further stiffened Israeli unwillingness to relinquish control of the area. At the same time, the chief political representative of the West Bank, Palestinians, the PLO, refused to negotiate with Israel and until 1988 was unwilling to recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel refused to negotiate with or recognize the PLO for years after that date. In 1988, Jordan's king Hussein renounced all administrative responsibility for the West Bank, thereby serving his country's remaining connections with the area. Meanwhile, anti-Israeli protests broke out among the Palestinians of the West Bank in December 1987 and became virtually a permanent feature West Bank life for next few years despite the Israelis army continued attempts to suppress the disorders. During 1967 war, Israel occupied West Bank and established military administration throughout the area, except in East Jerusalem, which Israel incorporated into itself, extending Israeli citizenship law and civil administration to the area. During the first decade of Israeli occupation, comparatively, there was little civil resistance to Israeli authorities and very little support among Palestinian residents of resistance activity. The period of relative calm began to wane during the late 1970s when, establishing settlements by early 80s, the settlements numbered in the scores. Land businesses and the buildings were expropriated from Palestinian inhabitants, many of whom were long absent, having fled the wars of 1948 and 1967. During the administration of Menachem, the number of Israeli settlements more than tripled, and the number of Israeli settlers increased more than fivefold. As a result of secret negotiations begun in April 1993, Israel and the PLO reached agreement in September on a plan to gradually extend self-government to the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza Strip over a 5-year period to a final settlement of the issue of Palestinian statehood. Under the plan, Israel's civilian and military administration would be dissolved and the Israeli army withdrawn from populous Palestinian areas. In the West Bank, the plan's actual implementation began in May 1994 with Israel's withdrawal from the town of Jericho and its environs. By 2000, the Palestinian Authority controlled less than one-fifth of the West Bank, while Israeli occupation in some areas combined with Palestinian Authority local administration continued in the remainder. In 2006 parliamentary elections, Fatah, an influential force in Palestinian politics since its foundation by Yasser Arafat in 1950s, suffered a decisive loss to Hamas, reflecting years of dissatisfaction with Fatah's governance, which was criticized as corrupt and inefficient. The victory of Hamas, a group that was regarded by many as terrorist organization, resulted in sanctions and boycotts from Israel, the US, and the European Union. In year 2007, with violence escalating in Gaza Strip and the failure of a coalition government, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas dissolved the Hamas-led government and established in its place an emergency cabinet favoring Fatah. The increasingly violent power struggle between Hamas and Fatah resulted in split between the West Bank run by Fatah through the emerging Palestinian Authority government and the Gaza Strip controlled by Hamas. Israel and other members of the international community moved to aid the West Bank, offering shows of economic and diplomatic support for Abbas and Fatah while blockading the Gaza Strip. In 2011, after years of stalled peace talks, the Palestinian Authority began lobbying the international recognition of statehood and starting gaining partial recognition in 2012. Let's talk about the 1979 Camp David Agreement, the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. This historic agreement led to Israel returning to Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in return for diplomatic relations. An agreement was signed for negotiating a settlement of the Palestinian claims, but this was not successful. Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by Egyptian Islamic Jihad organization pursuant to a religious decree of Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who was convicted of 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Now let's look at the Camp David Accords. Israel and Egypt would sign a peace treaty in 1979 with US President Jimmy Carter mediating the Camp David Accords. Israel would return the Sinai to Egypt in exchange for recognition. Israel had to negotiate a resolution of Palestinian refugee dilemma, made an all-out war between Israel and Arab world less likely. Now let's talk about the rise of PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO is an umbrella organization for many groups which represent the Palestinian people. Currently, its officials controlled many positions in the Palestinian Authority, which governs Palestinian territory. Its most famous leader was Yasser Arafat, who died in 2004. The organization was founded in 1964. In 1974, the PLO was recognized by the UN as the representative of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Liberation Organization has also fought militarily against Israel's occupation of its land and has been involved in numerous terrorist acts against Israeli citizens. Began using terrorist activities to strike at Israel beginning in 1960s. It wanted to regain land for Palestinian Muslims. Renowned violence in 1990s. Regained limited autonomy for parts of West Bank and Gaza Strip under PLO control in 90s. Now let's talk about the first Intifada. Intifada is basically called as an uprising or resistance. In 1987, the Palestinians became frustrated with their living condition and lack of progress. They maintained that the Intifada was a protest of Israel's brutal repression, which included extrajudicial killings, mass detentions, house demolitions, indiscriminate torture, and deportations. Often, often Palestinians fought with Israelis with low tech weapons like rocks, but over the time they gained access to guns and the other explosives. By 1993, 1,162 Palestinians and 160 Israelis had died. Now we should talk about Oslo Accord. In 1993, the PLO and Israel signed a peace agreement to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The agreement included the following: withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Palestinian right to self-government through the creation of Palestinian Authority. The parties agreed to negotiate a final and permanent peace settlement in the near future. Permanent issues such as Jerusalem, refugees, Israeli settlements in the area should be solved. The Israeli government recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO recognized the right of the State of Israel to exist and renounced terrorism, violence, and its desire for the destruction of Israel. Then, after that, the Prime Minister of Israel, Rabin, was assassinated by a conservative Jew afraid of peace with PLO. Now, lastly, let's talk about the Intifada, which is the second Intifada. The Oslo Peace Accord failed to achieve a final settlement despite great efforts by Bill Clinton in the last months of his presidency. Israel and US claimed that Israel made historic offers for peace which Yasser Arafat rejected. Palestinians claimed that they could never sign an agreement that did not give complete Palestinian control over the Temple Mount and the holy sites in Jerusalem. The Second Intifada or uprising began in September 2000 following the visit of Israeli politician to the Temple Mount. The Second Intifada has been far bloodier than the first, as the suicide bombing has become a common tactic. Israel has responded by assassinating leaders that ordered the suicide attacks and entering Palestinian towns and tanks and strong force of search for terrorists. Death tolls are estimated as 4,000. Israel believes that the Yasser Arafat was not a true partner for peace, and it has gathered evidence that he has been involved in terrorist activity. His forces has refused to arrest Islamist militants like Hamas members. The Palestinians have grown frustrated by the lack of progress and continuing brutal occupation. Let's talk about the Gaza Strip. Territory occupying 140 square miles along the Mediterranean Sea just northeast of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip is unusual in being a densely settled area not recognized as a de jure part of any extant territory. Living conditions in the Gaza Strip are typically poor for a number of reasons. The region's dense and rapidly increasing population, inadequate water, sewage, and electrical services, high rates of unemployment, and from September 2007, sanctions imposed by Israel on the region. The political stable times, as much as one tenth of the Palestinians' population, travel daily to Israel, where they are not allowed to stay overnight to work in menial jobs. The political tensions and outbreaks of violence often led Israeli authorities to close border for extended periods, putting many Palestinians out of work. As a result, a thriving smuggling industry emerged, based on a network of subterranean tunnels linking parts of Gaza Strip with neighboring Egypt. The tunnels provided Palestinians with access to goods such as food, fuels, medicines, electronics, and weapons. Let's talk about the history of Gaza Strip. After the rule of Ottoman Empire ended, there in World War I, the Gaza area became part of the League of Nations mandate under British rule. Before this mandate ended, the General Assembly of UN in November 1947 accepted a plan for the partition of Arab Jewish of Palestine under which the town of Gaza and an area of surrounding territory were to be allotted to the Arabs. British mandate ended on May 15, 1948, and on the same day the first Arab-Israeli war began. Egyptian forces soon entered the town of Gaza, which became the headquarters of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force in Palestine. As a result of heavy fighting in 1948, the area around the town under Arab occupation was reduced to a strip of territory of 25 miles. This area became known as Gaza Strip. Its boundaries were demarcated in the Egyptian-Israeli Armistice Agreement of February 24, 1949. The Gaza Strip was under Egyptian military rule from 1949 to 1956 and again from 1957 to 1967. From beginning, the area's chief economic and social problem was the presence of large number of Palestinian Arab refugees living in extreme poverty in solid camps. The Egyptian government did not consider the area part of Egypt and did not allow the refugees to become Egyptian citizens or to migrate to Egypt or to other Arab countries where they might be integrated into population. Israel did not allow them to return to their former homes or to receive compensation for their loss of property. The refugees were maintained largely through the aid of the United Nations Refugees Fund. Many of the younger refugees became 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 fedayeen. Their attacks on Israel were one of the causing precipitating the Sinai campaign during the Swiss crisis of 1956 when the Strip was taken by Israel. The Strip reverted to Egyptian control in 1957 following strong international pressure on Israel. In the Six-Day War of June 1967, the Gaza Strip was again taken by Israel, which occupied the region for next quarter century. The December 1989 violation and violent street clashes between Gaza's Palestinians and occupying Israeli troops marked the birth of an uprising that came to be known as intifada. In 1994, Israel began a phased transfer of governmental authority in the Gaza Strip to Palestinian Authority under the terms of Oslo Accords that were signed by Israel and PLO. The fledgling Palestinian government led by Yasser Arafat struggled with such problems as stagnant economy, divided popular support, stalled negotiations with Israel over further troop withdrawals and the area. The threat of terrorism from militant Muslim groups such as Islamic Jihad and Hamas, which refused to compromise with Israel and were intent on derailing the peace process. The beginning in late 2000, a breakdown in negotiation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel was followed by a further, more extreme outbreak of violence termed the Second or Aqsa Intifada. In an effort to end the fighting, Israeli PM Ariel Sharon announced in late 2003 a plan that centered on withdrawing Israeli soldiers and settlers from Gaza Strip. In September 2005, Israel completed the pullout from the territory and control of Gaza Strip was transferred to the Palestinian Authority, although Israel continued to patrol its borders and airspace. Now, the Gaza Strip under Hamas government. In 2006, Palestinian Authority parliamentary elections, Fatah, which had dominated the Palestinian politics, suffered a decisive loss to Hamas, reflecting years of dissatisfaction with Fatah's government, which was criticized as corrupt and inefficient. Hamas' victory prompted sanctions by Israel, US, and European Unions. The Gaza Strip was the site of escalating violence between the competing groups, and a short-lived coalition government was ended in June 2007 after the Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip and a Fatah-led emergency cabinet took control of the West Bank. Despite calls by Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas for Hamas to relinquish its position in the Gaza Strip, the territory remained under Hamas control. Blockade of Gaza Strip. In autumn 2007, Israel declared the Gaza Strip under Hamas a hostile entity and approved a series of sanctions that included power cuts, heavy restricted imports, and border closures. In January 2008, facing sustained rocket assaults into southern settlements, Israel broadened its sanctions, completely sealing its borders with Gaza Strip and temporarily preventing fuel imports. Later that month, after nearly a week of intensified Israeli blockade, Hamas forces demolished portions of the barrier along Gaza Strip, Egyptian border, closed from Hamas mid 2007 takeover until 2011, opening gaps through which, according to some estimates, hundreds of thousands of Gazans passed into the Egypt to purchase food, fuel, and goods unavailable under the blockade. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak temporarily permitted the breach to alleviate civilian hardships in Gaza before efforts could begin to restore the border. Let's talk about the another important event, which was Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is a holy day of Israel as the Muslim has an Eid day as the holy day. At this day, the armies of Egypt and Syria attacked the Israel just to revenge them when they attacked in 1967 war at Eid day. On the afternoon of October 6, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel simultaneously on two fronts. With the element of surprise to their advantage, Egyptian forces successfully crossed the Suez Canal with greater ease than expected, while Syrian forces were able to launch their offensive against Israeli positions and break through to the Golan Heights. The intensity of the Egyptian and Syrian assaults, so unlike the situation in 1967, rapidly began to exhaust Israel's reserve stocks of munitions. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir turned to US for aid, while the Israeli government staff hastily improvised a battle strategy. The reluctance of US to help Israel changed rapidly when the Soviet Union commenced its own resupply effort to Egypt and Syria. US President Richard Nixon countered by establishing an emergency supply line to Israel, even though the Arab countries imposed a costly oil embargo and various US allies refused to facilitate the arms shipments. With the reinforcement on the way, the Israel Defense Forces rapidly turned the tide. Israel succeeded in disabling portions of air defenses, which allowed the Israeli forces, commanded by General Ariel Sharon, to cross the Suez Canal and surround the Egyptian Third Army. On the Golan Front, Israeli troops at heavy cost repulsed the Syrians and advanced to the edge of the Golan Plateau on the road to Damascus. On October 22, United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 338, which called for an immediate end to the fighting. Despite this, however, hostilities continued for several days thereafter, promoting the UN to reiterate the call for ceasefire with Resolutions 339 and 340. With the international pressure mounting, the war finally ceased. On October 26, Israel signed a formal ceasefire agreement with Egypt on 11 November 1973 and with Syria 1 year later on 31st May 1974. The war did not immediately alter the dynamics of Arab Israeli conflict, but it did have a significant impact on the trajectory of an eventful peace process between Egypt and Israel, which culminated in return of the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for lasting peace. Furthermore, although Israel had staved off any advance by Egypt to recapture the Sinai Peninsula during the war, it never restored its seemingly impenetrable fortifications along the Suez Canal that Egypt had destroyed on October 6. The results of conflict thus required two countries to coordinate accordingly. In short term, and made more immediate need for a negotiated permanent settlement to their ongoing disputes. In an effort to maintain the ceasefire between Israel and Egypt, a disengagement agreement signed on 18th January 1974 provided for Israel to withdraw its forces into the Sinai west of the Gedi passes and the Egypt to reduce the size of its forces on the east bank of the canal. The UN peacekeeping force established a buffer zone between two armies. The Israel Egypt agreement was supplemented by another signed on September 4, 1975 that included an additional withdrawal of forces and the expansion of UN buffer zone. On March 26, 1979, Israel and Egypt made history by signing a permanent peace agreement that led to Israel's full withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula and the normalization of ties between the two countries. Now let's talk about the current situation in Palestine and Israel. Things have escalated since the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan in mid April 2021 with nightly clashes between the police and the Palestinians. They threatened eviction of some Palestinian families in East Jerusalem has also caused rising anger. There are a number of issues which Israel and Palestinians cannot agree on, and this process is continuing day by day. Thank you.